Thank you for being here. We're going to talk about in this segment science and the Bible versus theistic evolution. We want to answer this question, why not theistic evolution? Because, that's where most of our country is they're typically theistic evolutionists. They believe in God, but they also accept evolution. So they believe in theistic evolution, that God used evolution to do all this. So why not accept that? Well, first of all, it's just scientifically wrong. And we're going to talk a little bit more about science versus evolution. Evolutionists say dinosaurs evolved and became extinct 70 million years before man evolved. And that's why dinosaur fossils are so important in teaching evolution to children, because children love dinosaurs. I personally love dinosaurs too. But they don't show the evolutionary theory to be true. The Bible says man and all animals were created during the last 2 days of creation. This would have man coexisting with the dinosaurs. Do you realize the Bible seems to mention dinosaurs? You look at Job chapter 40, verses 15 through 24, it talks about behemoth. When you look at behemoth, some translations call him a hippopotamus. Let me just tell you, it's not a hippopotamus. A hippopotamus has a tail like a switch. The description of this animal in Job 40 is he has a tail like a cedar. He'd stand in the Jordan River during flood stages and just lift his head up. Let me tell you, rushing water has tremendous force. This is a huge animal that could stand in the middle of a flooding river and just lift its head up to breathe and not worry about it. Had a huge tail like a cedar. I believe perhaps he is describing a Gigantosaurus, one of the largest fossil dinosaurs that we have record of. And I think there's a lot more evidence that dinosaurs coexisted with man. You look at this iron hammer. Enclosed in the rock, there are fossils. And these fossils date to 140 million years ago when dinosaurs were living. And yet that's clearly a hammer made by man. It's got an iron shaft with a wooden handle. And the fossils will date it to the time of the dinosaurs. This is in a small museum up near the Paluxy River in Texas. You look at these fossil footprints. Some people argue about them, but they're clearly fossilized footprints of a shoe. And in those shoes, you see trilobites. And so you see enlarged, these trilobites are in the shoe. Now, if the trilobite is an animal that dates back to 400 million years, that's before the dinosaurs. Because dinosaurs supposedly began to evolve 270 million years ago. So now you got the trilobites and what? Evidence for man being with the trilobite before the dinosaurs. What about the evolutionary horse series? The evolutionary horse series is created more out of imagination than from fossil evidence. It's in almost all the books on evolution. It's in almost all the books that just talk about horses. You see these pictures of this horse evolution. Now, George Gaylord Simpson was a world-known Harvard professor of paleontology. And he says a uniform continuous transformation of the Hyracotherium, that's the little bitty horse, up to Equus, the modern day horse, so dear to the hearts of generations of textbook writers, never happened in nature. Just didn't happen. Bruce McFadden of the Ford Museum of Natural History said over the years, fossil horses have been cited as a prime example of orthogenesis, in other words, straight line evolution. It can no longer be considered a valid theory. But we find that once a notion becomes part of accepted scientific knowledge, it's very difficult to modify or reject it. In other words, even when we understand it's not true, it's hard to get people to quit saying it and quit putting it in the textbooks. Colin Patterson, the British Museum of Natural History, said there have been an awful lot of stories, some more imaginative than others. The most famous example, still on exhibit downstairs, his museum, the British Museum of Natural History. Out of Imagination is the exhibit on horse evolution, prepared 50 years ago. That has been presented as a literal truth in textbook after textbook, and yes, Dr. Patterson, in your museum. Now I want you to notice the date, 1984. So he says 50 years ago, we knew better than this, but we still have it. Goes along with that statement that once we start telling the story, we just like telling it. When my wife and I spent about a week in London on our way to Germany, we went to that museum and I got to thinking about it. I said, wonder if this place is still there. Because now we're going from 1984 all the way to 2013. Yes, it's still there. At least it was in 2013. Now it's a very, very dark room, and so it's hard to get a great picture. But on the left, you can see where it's talking about the hierarchy theorem, and on the right, you've got a model of this really small horse, and this supposedly dates back to 50 million years ago. And then they've got all the other examples of these horses all the way up to the modern day horse, the Equus, dating back to the last 2 million years. So this is still in the British Museum of History, at least in 2013 it was, and they had known about it 50 years earlier in 84 to not be based in truth, and yet you just keep teaching it and keep teaching it, and you keep putting it in the textbooks. Now this is a picture of the textbook for honors biology students used in our high schools when my children were going through school. And you see in this textbook this series of the modern horse. Now here is the textbook that's used today for honor students in the high school. And I'll tell you what's interesting, because we have such a huge population in Texas. Our textbook committees pick the books for Texas, but by default, we're picking textbooks for much of the rest of the country. I have a very close friend, one of my best friends, served as an elected board member on the textbook committee for a couple of years. I know how it works. Works for Texas and everywhere else. So the modern textbook still shows horse evolution, even though it's not based in fact, even though it's fiction. You know, there ought to be a law against putting fiction in textbooks. You know, there is a law that makes that illegal. But we do it anyway. And that's a shame. This is science fiction. It's not based in truth. And then what about evolution's biogenetic law that ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny? When I was in comparative anatomy as an undergraduate, we heard the story about ontogeny recapitulating phylogeny 3 days a week. No, or maybe it's 2 days a week, Monday and Wednesday. This philosophy dates all the way back to a gentleman known as Ernst Haeckel. He was a medical doctor, taught embryology in Germany. These terms were coined by Ernst Haeckel in 1866. Now you remember, Origin of Species was published in 1859. He was such an advocator for Darwinist theory that he presented this to try to prop up the theory. It was a fraudulent theory, and I'm going to show you how fraudulent it was. But this idea that embryonic development of the individual recapitulates through their evolutionary history by passing through the adult forms of the ancestors as they develop. Now, as you'll see in just a moment, there was 24 drawings that Haeckel presented. These drawings were drawings that he got from another individual. Haeckel was also a noted artist. And he took these drawings, if we can go back, and he started doctoring these drawings, okay? Racing and putting them in as he wanted to show. Still in textbooks today. My younger son's father-in-law, before they had ever met, I was preaching for the congregation where he was an elder in Tennessee, and I was eating lunch in their home, and he says, you know, I wasn't taught ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. I said, it's in your textbooks. He said, I don't think so. I said, well, isn't that your library right over there? He had a big set of books there in his living room, and I said, go over there and look. And he goes over and he gets it, and he says, you know, sure enough, it's in the textbooks. I said, maybe you were just lucky that they didn't present that to you. I said, it was crammed down our throat over and over again. You see these 24 drawings by Haeckel is to show that fish, salamanders, all the way up to humans, we all have this same beginning. And again, these are taught and shown in the textbooks today. And here's what Haeckel did. He redesigned the middle stages of embryonic development to look like the beginning stages. The beginning stages, as you see at the very top. The middle stages are what actually are. And that's what he redesigned and called them the beginning stages. When you look at this, the middle row shows how these embryos actually are for all these different organisms, from fish all the way to people. But the top row shows how Haeckel redesigned them. He redrew them and presented them as truth. Now, you can find on the internet, it's kind of hard to find this, but you can find it, where Haeckel was under a hearing at his university. And they showed him to be a fraud. Convicted of fraud many, many years ago, and yet this is still taught to be the truth today. Now, when I went to undergraduate school at Stephen F. Austin, they would not allow pre-med and pre-dental majors to take human anatomy and physiology. That it was really a shame. They made us take comparative anatomy. It would have been better to learn human anatomy, getting ready for gross anatomy in dental and medical school. But no, they want us to learn comparative anatomy and learn this theory as truth that ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. Why? You go to the abortion clinics, and one of the ways in which they help young ladies feel better about an abortion, they'll say, well, this being inside you is still in the jellyfish stage or in the fish stage. And if it's taken out, it's just like taking a fish out of water. It's not human life. Yeah, so they want all the medical and dental students to believe that. That's wrong. It's based in falsehoods. The theory of recapitulation was destroyed in 1921, and there's evidence even before that in the 1800s they showed it to be fraud. By Professor Walter Garstang in a famous paper, since then no respectable biologist has ever used the theory of recapitulation because it's utterly unsound, created by a Nazi-like preacher named Haeckel. Do you know why Hitler felt justified in what he did in destroying millions of people? He believed in the theory of evolution. And I'm going to tell you, I have even known of preachers in non-institutional churches to believe in theistic evolution and justify their racism because of evolutionary teaching. You take evolution to its natural limit and it produces racism. The very idea, we'll talk a little more about this tomorrow, that you judge a person by the color of their skin, whether they have more or less melanin in their skin to pigment their skin. How preposterous. But this theory has helped produce racism, abortion. It's helped people misunderstand the truth. Keith Thompson, the president of the Academy of Natural Sciences, said, surely the biogenetic law is as dead as a doornail. It was finally exercised from biology textbooks in the 50s. Wow, I wish that was true. As a topic of serious theoretical inquiry, it was extinct in the 20s. Yes, I wish it was no longer in the textbooks, but it still continues to be in the textbooks today. in the ones that were taught when my children were in school, and this is the modern day textbook for honors biology students in high schools. Still teaching this theory of homology with embryos. And I would suggest that this is science fiction. Now, the geologic time scale is supposed to be evidence of evolution. It's supposed to be like a history book to show that evolution truly happened. But you need to understand there are a number of problems with the geologic column. It's supposed to represent the evolutionary tree. It's supposed to represent how all life evolved. But that evolutionary tree did not come from evidence from fossils. All we know is the data out at the nodes, the tips of the branches, not from the beginning to the tips. Everything in between is just an assumption. Notice Professor Stephen Jay Gould, avid evolutionist, said the evolutionary trees that adorn our textbooks have data only at the tips and nodes of their branches. The rest is inference, however reasonable, not the evidence of fossils. You don't get the evolutionary tree from evidence from fossils. It does not come from the fossil record. Dr. Colin Patterson said, I fully agree with your comments on the lack of evolutionary transitions in my book. If I knew of any fossil living, I would certainly have included them. I will lay it on the line. There is not one such fossil. So Patterson is asked, hey, this book you wrote on evolution, what about the transitions forms? He says, there's not any. I'd have put them in the book. David Robson, in the years after Darwin, his advocates hoped to find predictable progressions. In general, they have not been found, yet the optimism has died hard, and some pure fantasy has crept into textbooks. Yes, there is a lot of fantasy in textbooks. And Dotton Patton on Evolution of the Earth wrote, we have arranged the groups in a traditional way with the simplest forms first, the progressively more complex forms following. This particular arrangement is arbitrary and depends on what definition of complexity you wish to choose. So the order is arbitrary. And the definition of complexity is just an assumption. You see, some people say the trilobite had an eye more complex than the human being. Yet it's a more simple animal, some say. W. Swinton of the British Museum of Natural History said the evolutionary origin of the bird is largely a matter of deduction. There's no fossil evidence of the stages through which the remarkable change from reptile to bird was achieved. This is what they teach. Birds evolved from reptiles, and yet there's no fossil evidence for that at all. Oh, there's another major problem for the evolutionists with the evolutionary tree, and it's the actual content of these earliest layers. You look at the geologic column. The very lowest layers are called the Cambrian and the Precambrian layer. Now, when you think about that, and you start seeing all this talk about the Cambrian explosion, all the way down there in the very lowest layers of the data is the Cambrian layer. And now we talk about the Cambrian explosion. Richard Dawkins, very popular writer in all your bookstores, has written so many books against creation, hates creation, loves evolution. In The Blind Watchmaker, he said, and we find many of them already in an advanced state of evolution. The very first time they appear, it is as though they were just planted there without any evolutionary history. Needless to say, this appearance of sudden planting has delighted creationists. Dawkins says, when you look at the geologic record, what do you see? You see what a creationist would expect to see. Complexity right there at the very lowest layers of the geologic column. Richard Monastrisky said the remarkable complex forms of animals we see today suddenly appeared. This moment right at the start of the Earth's Cambrian period marks evolutionary explosion that filled the seas with the Earth's first complex creatures. This is Genesis material, gushed one researcher. Again, when you look at the geologic column and you see what is actually there, it is what a creationist, one who believes in Genesis, would expect to find, not the evidence for evolution. Stephen Jay Gould again said the Cambrian explosion occurred in a geologic moment. We have reason to think that all major anatomical designs may have made their evolutionary appearance at that time. Not only the phylum Chordata itself, but all its major divisions. Now, you and I are in the phylum Chordata. The phylum Chordata is the phylum of living beings that have a backbone with a neural tube. But not just the phylum was present in the Cambrian. All of the major divisions of Chordata are found there. Then you also see Stephen Gould saying, since the so-called Cambrian explosion, no new phyla of animals have entered into the fossil record. We see another quote taken for Discover. The large animal phyla of today were present already in the early Cambrian, and that they were distinct from each other as they are today. Well, there's a third major problem for the evolutionists with the geologic record, and it's the process of fossilization itself. When you see the process of fossilization, you see a fossil, you do not see a situation where it's long periods of time. People just look at a fossil and go, man, that is old. That's not what you necessarily see. What you see is evidence of rapid catastrophe. In Dunbar and Rogers on Principles of Stratigraphy, they said to some thoughtful stratigraphers, this amazing discovery, billions of years, presented a dilemma. For if the known stratified rocks have been accumulating throughout the vast span of time, the average rate of depositions must have been extremely slow. Yet there's very good evidence that the individual beds accumulated rapidly. You see, they're talking about these layers, fossil layers, sedimentary layers. The evidence is it happened very, very rapidly. I'm going to share with you a little secret. My wife loves shrimp. You'll make her happy, get her with some shrimp. Brother Long, you knew my father-in-law very well, and he would bring home a big, it's like a gallon bucket of fresh shrimp, and we would peel them and devein them and get them ready, you know, whether you ate them frozen or if you fried them or grilled them. But inevitably, there'd always be one shrimp that would be left out. And you go back hours later and you see that shrimp, and it was just destroyed. Just took a short period of time for it to decompose and look just yucky. You see a fossil like this with all of the details, you see rapid catastrophe. It didn't have thousands of years to slowly become a fossil. Something covered this up, pressurized it, preserved it, fossilized it in a very quick way. I show you now a picture of a fossilized fern. When I was a child, we moved to Portland, Oregon for my dad to preach in Portland. And right across from our first house, there was what we called the forest. And it was large Douglas fir trees, but under those fir trees were ferns. And I would cut one and bring it in the house, and my mom would get out a vase and we'd put it in the water. To my disappointment, only a couple hours later, in spite of being in water, those fronds would just curl up. You see, when you see a fossil fern, you see evidence of rapid catastrophe. Something had to cover that up and fossilize it quickly before those fronds could curl up. Fossilization indicates a very rapid action. There are so many fossil fish that you can go to stores and buy these fossils. I have several in my study because I like looking at them. And what's interesting, you don't just see fossil fish with one or several, but a lot of times you'll see fossil fish that were fossilized, all the details, in the process of swallowing another fish. How long did it take for this fossil to form? Long periods of time? Let me tell you what I think probably happened when you see fish like this, and the next one I'm getting ready to show. Maybe in the worldwide flood or another catastrophe, you've got a fish swallowing a fish, and sediment just comes laying in on top of it and starting the process of fossilization. Now, that's not the story being told by the media and in the classrooms. A number of years ago, we were at West Texas A&M University. One of our children was in preschool. It was dinosaur days, so they took them to the Museum of Natural History there. And there was a graduate student, white coat, big sandbox, cattle bones in the sand. She said, "No, these are cattle bones, but this represents what paleontologists do. They go out looking for bones of fossils. And how these dinosaurs were fossilized is what happens is this. A dinosaur would die, and then over thousands and thousands of years, the dirt blows in and covers it up, and this becomes part of the sediment, and the dinosaur is fossilized." This is one of those times I didn't raise my hand. I just sat there and listened. And I thought, what do most of us Texans do when we hear something that preposterous? At least in our head, well, bless your heart. And I thought about that, and I'm like, there's not a cowboy in West Texas that believes that. I grew up in cowboy country. This is cowboy country itself. It's not uncommon to find me in a cowboy hat and boots. It's where I live. In fact, I'll just share something with you. There's 3 stages of cattle production. You've got the cow-calf stage. When a calf gets about 300 pounds, and there's the next stage, the stocker calves, where you may raise them out on grass from 300 to 700 pounds. You take them to auction. They become a feeder calf at about 700 to 800 pounds. You put them in a feedlot, and you get them ready for market by feeding them just corn and all sorts of other goodies that make them fat. Draw a compass point in Dumas, Texas, or Amarillo, Texas, go out 200 miles and do that circle, and 1/3 of all the cattle that are in feed yards are in that circle. So when I say what cowboys would believe, yeah, I know cowboys. Now, I'm not saying I'm a cowboy, but I grew up with cowboys. And I'm going, there's not any cowboy to believe that story. You have a cow die out in the field? Does it lay there for thousands of years to become a fossil? If the rancher doesn't drag it off and have it disposed, what will happen is, even if there were no predators, like, vultures and coyotes that come in and gnaw on it and eat on it and cut off a leg and drag it over behind a bush, if none of that took place, microorganisms would totally destroy that animal before it could become a fossil. So cowboys don't believe that story because it's just not true. Some rapid catastrophe. It could be the La Brea tar pits. An animal falls into the tar pits, it's fossilized perhaps. Or maybe a worldwide flood or even a local flood, but something's got to cover it up in a hurry and fossilize it. When you see fossils, that does not represent long periods of time. Look at this jellyfish and the jellyfish becoming a fossil. A jellyfish is as much as nothing as you can possibly imagine, and yet we have fossil records of the jellyfish. Well, let's skip past it. There we go, the fossil record of a jellyfish. Not long periods of time, rapid catastrophe. There's a fourth problem, huge problem for the evolutionists with the geologic column. It's the abundance of polystrate fossils, fossils that are within fossil layers. When you see the geologic column, one of the things you never see in books, never talked about in school, is polystrate fossils. You don't see them drawing trees, fossilized trees, through these layers of sediment. I didn't even know about this until I got out of college. I started doing more study upon it, and I'd seen the geologic column diagrammed and given to us and told to memorize every component. And what you see here is a whole collage of fossil trees growing through a number of layers, of sedimentary layers. A tree does not take millions of years to grow and cannot withstand growing through all these sedimentary layers that are so commonly thought of as being old. In Dunbar and Rogers says, in the internal evidence in the strata, however, belies these estimates. In the coal measures of Nova Scotia, for an example, the stumps and trunks of many trees are preserved standing upright as they grew, clearly having been buried before they had time to fall or rot away. Here, sediment certainly accumulated to a depth of many feet within a few years. You understand how the strata has to be laid down, and you see these polystrate fossilized trees, then you understand what we're talking about here. Here's a picture of a polystrate fossil, about 30 feet tall, near the Cookeville, Tennessee Kettles coal mine. Now, these polystrate fossils represent two major problems for the evolution. First of all, the age of the fossil strata. When this picture comes up, what you're going to see is the first half of this tree is in coal, and the next half of the tree is in shale. Now, if you understand the theory of how coal forms, let's see if I can bring her up. Here we go. Hope it didn't go past it. Okay. The theory for coal formation is this. You take about 10 to 11 feet of fresh green vegetation and you compress it down to a foot, compact greenery, and then you take that and 7 or 8 feet of that and you compress that down to about a foot of coal. Here's a tree. Did it grow through coal? Not on your life. Could it withstand coal formation? No way. And then shale formation in the latter part of the tree? When you see this, you see evidence of a very young situation covered up through rapid catastrophe. And these fossilized trees in all these layers are found all over the world. And if you talk to a coal miner, they will tell you that's absolutely what you see. So these evolutionary trees, that everything is related to each other, coming from the single cell beginning all the way out to plants that were related to oak trees and animals and humans, that's just science fiction. There's not any truth in that at all. Now I want to ask another question about the evolutionary tree. When you think about this, have you ever considered this question? Because most people just look at this evolutionary tree, the geologic column, they accept it because the science teacher's teaching it to them. But I want you to think about this. We went through this progression last night of simple chemicals like hydrogen evolving into the whole periodic table, and then all these complex molecules, and then the beginning of life, and etc. But consider this one stage. Animals with exoskeletons. You have a lot of those down here on the coast. Crabs, they wear their skeleton on the outside. Lobsters, their skeletons on the outside, not the inside. Crayfish, the same way. Some of my close friends are Cajuns that live down in Beaumont and over in Louisiana. They love those crayfish. The skeleton on the outside. You ever considered how, in the evolutionary theoretical process, you went from skeletons on the outside to the inside? So you got bugs and crabs and lobsters, skeleton on the outside, and then they, for some reason, and I want to know how, they went from that to having the skeleton on the inside. That's a question they just can't answer. So why not theistic evolution? Well, first of all, theistic evolution is just scientifically wrong because evolution's wrong. But there's another thing. The Bible will not allow theistic evolution. And I want you to see why the Bible will not allow theistic evolution. The Bible and evolution are in conflict. And when you consider the order of creation, then you start realizing how wrong evolution is, even theistic evolution. You see, on day 1, God created the heavens, the earth, light, day and night. On day 2, the firmament. On day 3, the dry land. Day 4, the sun, moon, and the stars. Day 5, water, life, and the birds of the air. On day 6, the land, animals, and man. Man was created from the dust of the ground, fully functional, before he created woman, and he made woman from man's ribs. Now, evolution has a different order. Evolution has the sun and the stars before the earth. God said he made the earth on day 1, the sun, the stars, day 4. So give them billions of years. It conflicts with the Bible record of the order of creation. Evolution say the sun evolved before the planets. God said no. He made earth, which is a planet, day 1. He made the sun on day 4. He made the sun on day 4. He made the plants on day 3. Evolutionists have the sun is Earth's first light. God said he made light on day 1 before there was a sun. Someone says, well, what was the source of the light? God is light. If that's not enough for you, then do what I tell my wife every once in a while. She'll ask me a question I just can't answer. And I'm the first to admit there's a lot of things I can't answer. And I'll say, well, put that on your heaven list. And if it's still important to you when you get there, ask God. Because I don't know. But he made light on day 1. Marine life before the land plants is what evolutionists say, but the land plants are on day 3, marine life on day 5. Evolution has insects before the fish. If they were land insects, they were on day 6. And the fish were on day 5. Evolution has land animals before the birds. That birds evolved from the reptiles, the land animals. No. God said he made the birds on day 5. He made land animals on day 6. And he said he made both sexes of man evolving from an ape-like ancestor the evolutionist does. God says no, he made them both at the same time. You see, on the same day, man then woman. The order of creation will just not allow evolution. And so why not theistic evolution? Well, the Bible will not allow theistic evolution, number 1, because the order of evolution is different and totally contrary. But secondly, the Bible will not allow theistic evolution because evolution is all about requiring trillions upon trillions of bad mutations, evolutionary failures, and dead ends to evolve a creation. And when you look at the record of what it says in the Bible, on day 5 in Genesis 1:21, for he made the waters, animals, and the birds, he says, and it was good. On day 6, he says it was very good. And there's absolutely no macroevolution happening, no failures, no bad mutations. Every step of the way it was good. Number 3, we see that the Bible does not allow for vast periods of time to evolve a creation, theistically or atheistically, because there's been 6 literal days. And yet, as we've talked about, evolution shows this vast period of time. And in our last lecture, we talked about all these theories that the theistic evolutionists want to present in order to try to get the Bible to go along with these theistic evolutionary theories. No, the Bible defines a day as being an evening and a morning, Genesis chapter 1 and in verse 5. Someone says, well, those 24-hour days, well, you know that Jesus Christ defines a day that way. In John chapter 11 verse 9, Jesus answered, are there not 12 hours in a day? In other words, talking about daylight. And then you got nighttime, another 12 hours. If any man walk in the day, he is humbled not because he seeth the light of the world. Yes, the Bible's talking about 24-hour days. And then we looked in our last period about Exodus chapter 28 through 11, about the 6 days of creation. They're the same days as the Israelites had in the wilderness. And then you see that literal word, days, is the Hebrew word yamin. 845 times in the Hebrew Bible, no exceptions, always means a literal day. So in Exodus 20, when he's given the 10 Commandments, he said, I made this world in 6 literal days. Theistic evolution is simply another version of evolution, which is a lie. Now, is it okay to believe lies? We shouldn't lie one to another. But you know, we deceive animals, don't we? In a moment, you're going to see a picture of Deacon, a rodent killer, and what a little lie will do. When you look at this, you recognize in the next slide that there's only 0.005% poison. It's blood thinner. And 99.995% of that is actually good food. So the rodent eats the food, only 0.005% poison, and it kills him. So it's okay to just keep teaching the young people lies and lying one to another and believing that that's the way we came about, is through evolution. What difference does it make if one believes all these theories? I believe it's just a matter of how much poison that you're willing to take. How much poison are you willing to take? Do you realize the effect that this theory has had on our society? In 1966, Time magazine came out with a cover picture and a cover article asking, "Is God dead?" A previous article had been written in October 1965. It had investigated a trend among 1960s theologians to write God out of the field of theology. In fact, you know where the social gospel came from? After 1959 Origin of the Species, people who are preachers start believing in evolution. So you have people that were trained only to be preachers. They have no other skills. They're not carpenters or plumbers. What am I going to do? You start finding social reasons to justify your religion. And the social gospel began to grow. Well, the 1966 article looked in greater depth at the problems facing modern theologians in making God relevant to an increasingly secular society. Modern science seemed to have eliminated the need for religion to explain the natural world, and God took up less and less space in people's daily lives. So when you look at this world, there's always been two paradigms. That God has created everything, and man is to live with each other under the idea of peace, joy, and love. Yet the mechanism that Darwin taught was survival of the fittest. In other words, if the fittest are to survive, might makes right. That's why we have so much war. If you figure you're ruling your nation and you're tough enough to take over another one, just move in on them. Mine makes right. They're too weak to defend themselves. You've seen this in your lifetime. It goes on right now. It's going on right now, and it's gone on my entire life. The idea that might makes right. Hitler thought might makes right. He believed in evolution, didn't believe in God. He thought, I'll just take over the world. Evolution says progress comes from killing off the weak and develop a stronger species. Darwin said in his autobiography, a man who has no assured and ever-present belief in the existence of a personal God or a future existence of retribution and reward can have for his rule of life, as far as I can see, only to follow those impulses and instincts which are the strongest or seem to him to be the best ones. In other words, Darwin said, if it feels good, then just do it. Does anybody act that way today? I saw an interview of Jeffrey Dahmer when he was in prison shortly before he was murdered. Now, do y'all remember Jeffrey Dahmer? He murdered 17 males, raped, dismembered, necrophilia, cannibalism. They were all involved. There's an hour difference between us and Albuquerque, New Mexico. One of my closest friends, who's now passed on, was a gospel preacher who had preached in Dumas and then moved to Albuquerque. And I picked up the phone and I said, Rick, put your VCR on, put a tape in. We got to record this. It'll be coming up the next hour. And so they were interviewing Dahmer, and he said this: one of the main reasons for my continuing to do the things I did for so long was because I felt I didn't have to be accountable to anybody. I just felt you lived, you died, and that was it. There's no lasting consequences. If a person doesn't think there's a God to be accountable to, then what is the point in trying to modify your behavior to keep it within acceptable ranges? That's how I thought anyway. I always believed the theory of evolution is truth, that we all just come from the slime, and when we died, that was it. There's nothing. Now, he later claims to become a Christian, and I'm not going to argue that one way or the other. I'm just showing you that Dahmer said the reason he did what he did is because he believed in evolution. How many other times have we had mass murders in this country where it turned out the people behind it were acting the same way Dahmer was acting? I could name them one after another, and you would recognize them. You see, evolution elevates the mind to man. We worship the earth because of evolution. In some locations more than others. It's all about worshiping the earth. And we have a lot of problems facing society because of evolution. Think about abortion, pornography, homosexuality, lawlessness, almost everything that goes with this woke mentality. And the foundation behind it all is what? Yeah, it's evolution. Now, you see this article that I brought up, written by Barbara Reynolds. It says, your kids go ape in school, so here is why they go ape in school. And we magnify this, and she wrote, in most schools, Johnetta and Johnny are being taught evolution. That humankind evolved from apes. Hey, teach them they evolved from apes, what do you expect them to behave like? Teach them they evolved from earthworms. What do you expect them to behave like? Well, let me tell you what affected our country. In 1957, the Soviets sent Sputnik into space, the first satellite into space. And the federal government looked at the Soviet Union and said, well, here is, at least on the federal level over there, a atheistic society. And they seem to be ahead of us in science and technology. A couple of years later, it's 1959, the 100th year anniversary of Darwin's book. Our government made a decision that we need to start teaching a lot more evolution. Before this point in time, before the 60s, when you look at a science book that dealt with evolution, there was only about 2,000 to 3,000 words on the subject. However, beginning in 1963, with the decision of our government to really push evolution, the average textbook went up to about 33,000 plus words on this subject. Our government wanted to tell you how important it is to believe that we evolved from a single cell beginning, earthworms, etc. Has our government ever been wrong on anything? Bobby Kennedy says we're wrong on nutrition. I think he's right. I've seen that for many, many years. And there's a lot of other things our government has not been right about and not been really forthright about. So how has this huge indoctrination of evolution affected our society since 1963? Well, teen STDs are up. Premarital sex in teens is up. Teen unwed pregnancies is very up. Unmarried couples cohabiting is up. In fact, in our country, it's safe to say that when you see a couple dating, you know what's going on. Now, it's not that that didn't happen when I was a teenager, but it wasn't the rule. I kind of resent this idea. You tell people, say, well, how long have you been married? They say, well, we've been together 30 years. And you go, well, how long have you been married? Well, we've been married 20, but we've been together 30. So, if that's not you, don't tell people we've been together. So I've been married 20 years. My wife and I have been married, I believe it's 47. Coming up on another anniversary. Excited. Teen suicide's up. violent crime offenses. Texas can't build prisons fast enough because of all the crime going on. So how has this huge indoctrination of evolution affected our society? Well, it certainly has not helped us spiritually, and it hasn't helped us academically either. Now, this is something you may not know. Since 1963, the SAT scores have been going down. Now, we didn't want to hurt the psyche of the students and taking SAT scores if they would realize their parents scored better than they did. So a number of years ago, the SATs were dumbed down. They were dumbed down so current students can score as well as their parents did, but it's on a dumber test. We're not doing better academically. I was presenting this series of lectures in the early 2000s in the metro area. A friend of mine came up to me afterwards and he said, "Have you seen Time magazine, January 31, 2000? I said, "No, I'll get a copy," because he started telling me about it. And in this magazine, Barbara Heinrich reviews Randy Thornhill and Craig T. Palmer's book, A Natural History of Rape. That's the book, and she's reviewing this book, A Natural History of Rape. She writes that rape, according to the evolutionary theorist, Randy Thornhill and Craig T. Palmer, represents just another seed-spreading technique favored by natural selection. Sure, it's nasty, brutish, and short on foreplay, but it gets the job done. At the bottom of this page, it says, hence, rape is not an act of pathology, but it's a venerable old strategy for procreation. What's natural isn't always nice. The very idea that people would say that rape is natural. Well, I'm going to tell you, if you believe the theory of evolution, then you believe we're just animals. I believe there's a plant kingdom, an animal kingdom, and then there's a human kingdom, the kingdom of man. And we are not animals. We didn't evolve from animals, but if we're just animals, then this is right. You see, this is the result of evolutionary thinking. Thornhill and Palmer's insistence that the rapist isn't a psychopath, just an ordinary fellow who's in touch with his inner caveman, leads to some dubious prescriptions. They want to institute formal training for boys in how to resist their natural sexual impulses to rape. That's not natural. That's a felony. And we need to quit teaching people that we're just animals, and this is natural behavior for animals. Does it make any difference? I think you can see that science of the Bible against evolution, theistic evolution, is a very important subject. Most people in this country who believe in God have accepted theistic evolution. Many of the religious leaders encourage this compromise. At the Smithsonian Institute of Natural History, I saw this plaque up that says many religious leaders and organizations have stated that evolution is the best explanation for the wondrous variety of life. That statement is true. Many religious leaders have accepted that and teach that. So, when Time magazine came out and said, "Is God dead?" the answer is no. God is alive. And God's Word is the Bible, and we need to value God's Word. And if we do that, we will have respect for the creation and take the proper care for our environment. However, we realize that man was put here as the environment steward, and the environment is here to serve man, as God said. Our thinking in every area needs to be the Bible is our guide. You see, John 8:32 says, "The truth shall make you free." You may be here this morning and you're ready to obey the gospel of Christ. It's not been a lesson on first principles of the plan of salvation. But if you know the Bible teaches that he that believeth and is baptized shall be saved, Jesus said that in Mark 16:16. And then Peter, by inspiration, said in Acts 2:38, "Repent and be baptized, every one of you, in the name of Jesus Christ, for the remission of sins, and you shall receive the gift of the Holy Spirit. If you realize those truths, and you're not yet a Christian, and you want to obey the gospel plan of salvation, then I ask you, won't you obey the invitation of Jesus today? Won't you come forward as we stand and sing that invitation song?